Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for that intro. Thank you to the Jordan Center for inviting me and for Alexandra Shpitalnik for organizing so much of this, and to all of you for coming. I appreciate that. I'm talking today about material from my ballet in the Cold War, and it's particularly exciting for me to be here, as Anne mentioned, because I completed this book in part with help from a fellowship from the Jordan Center and the Center for Ballet and the Arts. So it's exciting to bring the work back. Okay, at the height of the Cold War, as nuclear conflict loomed on the horizon, political leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union began a very strange practice. They boarded their ballet companies, sometimes over 100 dancers, stage managers, musicians, and administrators, onto jet planes and flew them around the world to give 2 to 3 month-long tours in other countries. For both governments, these tours were a way of impressing foreign audiences with their country's artistic accomplishments. In 1958, representatives from the two countries signed the Lacy-Zurubin Agreement, which allowed for a limited direct exchange between the two superpowers. With this agreement, ballet, which had long been considered a particularly Russian art form, suddenly became a prominent arena for Cold War conflict. In Ballet in the Cold War, I explore the early years of this exchange, examining 4 tours by Soviet companies in the United States and American companies in the Soviet Union. Of these tours, undoubtedly the most famous, is New York City Ballet's 1962 tour of the Soviet Union. From the futuristic Kremlin Palace of Congresses in Moscow to the elegant Kirov Theater in Leningrad, the company was greeted by cheers, bravos, and thunderous clapping. In city after city, by audience after audience, New York City Ballet was welcomed enthusiastically. However gratifying they were, such exuberant ovations came as a great surprise to American observers of the tour who had feared critical and popular outcry against the company. New York City Ballet's artistic director, George Balanchine, was famous as an innovator of neoclassical abstract ballets. Moreover, he had left the Soviet Union in 1924. American experts had assumed that he and his company would be sharply criticized in the Soviet Union. Instead, they were welcomed with open arms. Previous scholarly accounts have mostly evaluated this tour from an American perspective, and they thus generally place this success either in the context of Balanchine's development as a choreographer or the US's triumph in the Cold War. American dance historians have taken Soviet praise of Balanchine as a repudiation of both the government and the arts of the USSR. But the tour's reception is better understood through an exploration of Soviet sources and in the context of Soviet aesthetics. New York City Ballet arrived in Moscow at the height of the thaw, when ballet was undergoing enormous changes across the stages of the Soviet Union. Like most cultural shifts during the thaw, these changes were the subject of sustained debate. Because New York City Ballet arrived in Moscow during this time of transformation, the company's repertoire was evaluated by Soviet critics in the context of their ongoing arguments about the old and new styles of ballet. While American writers have understood Balanchine's works as fundamentally opposed to Soviet aesthetics and politics, Soviet critics did not receive them that way. Thus, I show that Soviet critics and audiences could appreciate Balanchine while reframing his works through a number of different official Soviet lenses. George Balanchine was born in St. Petersburg, Russia, under the name Georgy Balanchivadze. He studied at the Imperial Ballet School and performed at the former Mariinsky Theater until 1924, when he emigrated to Europe. Balanchine eventually made his way to the United States, and in 1946, together with American impresario Lincoln Kirstein, he founded Ballet Society, the group that would eventually be renamed New York City Ballet.
And your presentation, you might just want to put it into full screen. We're just seeing part of your screen now.
Oh, sorry. I'm going to then read. Give me 2 seconds.
No problem.
Thanks for letting me know.
No problem.
There we go.
Looks good.
Beautiful. We'll take it again. Not from the beginning. That would be sad. Okay. At the same time that Kirstein and Balanchine were establishing their new company, the US State Department was creating its fledgling cultural diplomacy program, and the two institutions quickly developed a symbiotic relationship. New York City Ballet was one of the dance companies most frequently chosen for the program. When it came time to pick an American ballet company for a Soviet tour, though, Balanchine, Kirstein, and the State Department's expert dance panel expressed concern about sending NYCB. They worried that Balanchine's choreography would be met with steep resistance from the Soviet government. Balanchine was famous in the United States for creating abstract ballets, works that revealed the form of musical composition without using stories or elaborate sets or props. As Kirstein, Balanchine, and the ANTA dance panel understood it, the very basis of Balanchine's aesthetics would contrast sharply with the realistic, narrative-driven ballets favored by Soviet companies. Kirstein expressed concern that the Soviet Ministry of Culture would seek either to reject Balanchine's works outright or to denigrate them in the official press. In a New York Times article leading up to NYCB's performances in the Soviet Union, American critic Alan Hughes summed up this position by questioning, how will the Soviets respond to the abstractions of Balanchine's choreography? It will be a miracle if the Russians understand what Balanchine is up to. But lucky for them, no miracle would be required. Kirstein and Balanchine were mistaken in their earlier assumptions about the state of Soviet ballet. It is true that Soviet ballets in the 1930s and 40s had tended towards massive, expensive, 2-hour socialist realist works known as dramballetti. These works contrasted enormously with Balanchine's stripped-down abstract aesthetic. But the dramballet largely fell out of favor during the Soviet thaw, the period of political change and debate triggered by Stalin's death in 1953. In ballet, this period of debate resulted in increased criticisms of the dramballet. In its place, a group of young artists promoted a new type of dance called choreographic symphonism, or symphonic dance. Instead of focusing on ballet's ties to dramatic theater and literature, the choreographic symphonists wanted to turn towards its similarities to music. Many argued that choreographers should make use of musical techniques such as motivic development and counterpoint to create continuous dancing rather than interrupting dancing for silent acting, as often happened in the dramballet. For example, Yuri Grigorovich, one of the most famous of the choreographic symphonists, was interested in creating large-scale formal structures on stage, overlapping multiple layers of choreography to match the multiple layers of musical lines, as in this example from Stone Flower. So I have learned from sad experience that video clips do not always work well on Zoom. So I'm going to go through a couple of still images just so that you can get a sense of what I'm hoping you're seeing when I press play on the video. So you'll see in the foreground 3 soloists performing short movements. In the middle ground behind them, a group of men performing a folk dance from earlier in the ballet. And still behind them, a group of women holding hands in a line and performing another different folk dance also from earlier in the ballet. And this matches in the music multiple melodies that are going on over one another. You'll continue to see those young men, particularly towards the left side of the stage, performing their dance, and the women behind them. Over to the right, another soloist starts spinning, and then all the dancers come together in lines for a unison part. So I hope you can see some of that in this clip. Like the choreographic symphonists, Balanchine's repertoire was centered around music and musical form. For example, his most famous work, Serenade, stages Pyotr Tchaikovsky's 1880 work Serenade for Strings. The music is unified by the use of a motto, a theme that appears throughout the symphony rather than just in one movement. Throughout the ballet Serenade, Balanchine sets the motto theme for the entire female corps, standing in nearly the same unusual stage pattern and performing variations on the same steps. In one particularly striking moment towards the end of the Tema Russo movement, Tchaikovsky brings back his motto theme in a way that demonstrates its similarities to the Russian folk song that underpins the rest of that movement. Balanchine likewise brings back his choreographic motive and fragments it to show its similarities to his version of Tchaikovsky's folk dance. So again, to give you some stills, this is going to be the start of that, sort of the end of that motto theme in the Tema Russo movement, with the dancers performing this version of those steps. Then as the motto theme fragments, the dancers step back at ever increasing speed until they leap forward into this jump that looks like the motto theme that they just performed, but also is the same as this movement for the Russian folk music that had been coming earlier. So I hope you can see this, one of the most beautiful moments from one of the best, my favorite ballets. Lovely, and actually both those are available on DVD if you couldn't catch this, so I recommend you checking them out. Okay. Both Balanchine's abstract neoclassicism and choreographic symphonism grew out of developments in early 20th century Russian ballet, particularly those of choreographers Michel Fokine, Leonid Massin, and Fyodor Lopukhov. So it is understandable that their work would overlap. Lopukhov in particular played a connecting role. Balanchine collaborated with him in the Soviet Union during the early 1920s, and he was an early promoter of the choreographic symphonists during the 1950s. Though they both cared deeply about music and musical structure, Balanchine and the Soviet choreographic symphonists used two very different models to understand the relationship between music, dance, and meaning in ballet. American critics and choreographers of the 1960s, led by Balanchine, positioned dance on a continuum with narrative at one end and music at the other. The more musical a ballet was under this system of thought, the less meaningful, and vice versa. The choreographic symphonists, on the other hand, conceptualized meaning and narrative as something that filled music and believed that choreographers could then translate this meaning into dance. Despite these differences in interpretation, the changes of the thaw meant that the Soviet dance scene was much more prepared to welcome Balanchine than anyone in the United States was aware of in 1962. There were multiple signs in the early 1960s that the Soviet government was relatively unconcerned about Balanchine's abstraction. Impresario Saul Hurok, who was in close contact with the Soviet Ministry of Culture, suggested that New York City Ballet should participate in the 1962 tours. Moreover, once the State Department's experts had approved the company's participation and the American and Soviet representatives had signed off on the exchange, two officials from the Soviet State Concert Association, or Goskoncert, flew to the United States to decide which of the NYCB ballets could be performed in the USSR. The list of works that they approved included almost all of Balanchine's works and coincided very closely to a recommended repertoire list that had been produced by the State Department's expert panel. The two officials only excluded 4 ballets from the NYCB repertoire: Balanchine's Ives and Orpheus, and Jerome Robbins's Afternoon of a Faun and The Cage. Their choices suggest that Goskoncert and the Ministry of Culture were much more concerned about keeping out NYCB's sometimes frank sexuality than they were in forbidding Balanchine's abstraction. Indeed, 3 of the 4 prohibited ballets had narratives. In their report back to the Ministry of Culture, the Soviet officials noted Balanchine's tendency toward abstraction, but dismissed it as a relatively unimportant issue, writing, "Balanchine announces that he is an adherent of pure art in ballet and loves to stage dances on music without a subject. However, he does not repudiate the realistic direction in ballet, and despite a strong modernist influence, he tries to preserve in his work the classic heritage of Russian ballet." New York City Ballet arrived in Moscow on October 6. The dancers' feet had hardly touched the tarmac when the debates over abstraction were set off, not by the Soviets, but by Balanchine himself. Balanchine made an appalling diplomat, doing everything in his power to disavow the similarities between his works and Soviet ballets. In doing so, he often overemphasized the abstract nature of his repertoire. In a well-publicized interview with Sovietsky artist, Balanchine argued dogmatically against Soviet aesthetics. In the short space of the article, Balanchine stated that ballet can speak about itself, by itself, and for itself. And if anybody's teaching Russian this semester and looking for a grammatical example of Sibya in all its different pieces, feel free to use this. He went on to state that ballet, quote, is flowers, it is beauty, it is poetry, and one should speak of it only in terms of aesthetics if one must speak of it at all. And I will add that this statement clearly struck a nerve with a lot of the readers, and a number of the reviewers brought it back up when they went to write about the company. Intriguingly, Balanchine's approach to the tour contrasted sharply with that of the State Department. The US Embassy in Moscow published a Russian language booklet describing the company in terms meant to make Balanchine's work seem more palatable to a Soviet audience. Those audiences had their first opportunity to see Balanchine's works for themselves on October 9th, when NYCB opened its tour at the Bolshoi Theater. All tickets were sold out in advance. After opening night, the company moved to the Kremlin Palace of Congresses. After performances in Moscow, they went on to Leningrad, Kiev, Tbilisi, and Baku. By all accounts, the performances were sold out and audiences cheered enthusiastically, even wildly. Throughout the weeks of the tour, and indeed for months after, long, intellectually engaged reviews of the company appeared in Soviet media outlets ranging from Pravda and Izvestia to specialist journals such as Sovietskaya Muzika. In these reviews, Balanchine's works provided fodder for the ongoing Soviet debates over drama ballet and choreographic symphonism. Though acceptance of choreographic symphonism was increasing in the years leading up to the 1962 tour, not all members of the Soviet ballet establishment approved of it. Those artists who were still devoted to the drama ballet opposed choreographic symphonism vehemently. And in the ballet world, the period of the thaw was marked by intense debates between proponents of the two styles. This argument largely hinged around interpretations of the concept of content. During the 1930s and 40s, content was defined in very limited terms. Under this system of thought, each ballet would only have one clear, easily readable narrative. Ballets would be crafted so that both music and dance flowed from the content of the libretto. During the thaw, supporters of the choreographic symphonist movement began pushing against this narrow reading of content as narrative. They argued that good dance should take its content from the music rather than simply from an external libretto. Moreover, some argued that good dance could reflect a broad range of content, including philosophical and spiritual, the type of content that they believed was also present in classical forms of instrumental music. Such arguments were characteristic of the Thaw-era, which saw public debate over many topics. Indeed, historian Nancy Condi has identified formalized debate, or as she calls it, ritual combat, between the old and the new as one of the key aspects of Thaw culture. Dancer Alexander Lapowry opened his review of Balanchine's troupe with a statement, "Without doubt, NYCB's performances are an important artistic event. And like any event, it creates its admirers and opponents. And where there are two sides, there arises argument, and in argument is born truth." Such a belief in the power of debate reflects the atmosphere of the thaw, and it is a fair summary of the company's Soviet reception. Overwhelmingly, Soviet critics praised Balanchine for his innovative movements and the New York City Ballet dancers for their excellent technique. Virtuoso dancers like Allegra Kent, Arthur Mitchell, Gloria Govrin, and Edward Villela were frequently praised in reviews, and audiences were likewise hugely excited by the level of dancing. During a performance in Leningrad, applause was so overwhelming that Villela broke company policy and gave an encore of one of his solos. Often the critics attributed NYCB's success to Balanchine's Russian heritage. Maria Sobyanina, who was one of Balanchine's staunchest supporters in the Soviet press, remarked as an opening gambit to her review that his biography, quote, confirms the fact that all the strongest developments of contemporary foreign choreography are directly or indirectly connected with the Russian school and its traditions, unquote. Balanchine unsurprisingly bristled at these attempts to claim him and often tried to remind the Soviets that he was Georgian by birth and American by choice. While Soviet reviewers were near unanimous in their praise for Balanchine's imagination and his company's technique, They varied wildly on the validity of the choreographer's approach to music and musical content. Those critics who still supported the older drama ballet, most prominently choreographer Rostislav Zakharov, took an unsurprisingly negative view of Balanchine's works, arguing that ballets without a plot did not and could not express any content. Many other critics, however, accepted that the instrumental scores to Balanchine's works possessed a humanist content and that therefore a ballet of the newer choreographic symphonic type would be artistically successful. This content into dance would be artistically successful. Now, of course, Balanchine himself had claimed multiple times in the Soviet press that he did not do this. And so Boris Slobodanokin, Natalia Roslavleva, and others asserted that Balanchine had only translated the superficial features of music into choreography. There was a group of critics, however, including dancers Mikhail Gabovich and Olga Lepeshinskaya, who defended Balanchine using the aesthetics of choreographic symphonism. Gabovich in particular was a vigorous supporter of Balanchine in his 2 reviews of the company. According to Gabovich, by embodying music by such composers as Bach, Tchaikovsky, and Prokofiev so vividly on stage, Balanchine's art also expressed a valid humanistic viewpoint, whatever the choreographer himself might say on the matter. Gabovich additionally argued that the classical dance vocabulary itself conveyed a kind of content by exploring the workings of the human body. Though for the most part, Soviet critics praised Balanchine's works, there were 2 ballets on the NYCB programs that did not meet with the approval of any Soviet critics, Agon and Episodes. Both were set to atonal scores by Igor Stravinsky and Anton Webern, respectively. Both featured dancers in practice clothes of leotard and tights on an empty stage, and both incorporated many of Balanchine's most drastic changes to choreographic technique. Of these aspects, the music was by far the most objectionable to Soviet critics because they felt it communicated little in the way of content to the audience. Lvova-Nokin argued that the work was, quote, choreographic geometry, algebra, chemistry, the audacious fission of an atomic nucleus in dance, anything at all, only not inspiration, not art if we take that to be the expression of living human emotions. Most of the sparing praise that Soviet critics had for Agon was reserved for its 2-star dancers, Arthur Mitchell and Allegra Kent, who were lauded for their ability to overcome Balanchine's dry choreography. Historian Claire Croft, who has interviewed many of the performers from the 1962 tour, similarly argues that Mitchell in particular should receive more credit for the company's Soviet success. Tellingly, a full report of the Soviet reviews never reached the United States. American newspapers, particularly the New York Times and the New York Herald Tribune, were eager to print news of the company's success, but were willing to forego nuance in order to foreground their accomplishments. John Martin, who had just retired as the New York Times dance critic, traveled to the Soviet Union with New York City Ballet in order to cover their progress. Such reporting constantly exaggerated the conflict between New York City Ballet and the Soviet dance establishment. Martin repeatedly referenced the revolutionary nature of Balanchine's ballets, claiming in a review of October 31st that, quote, the Soviet public, accustomed to productions larger and louder than life, consisting of a full evening of swashbuckling stories, punctuated by designedly applaudable bursts of bravura, was required to make a major adjustment in the face of this repertory made up entirely of dancing, shaped along musical lines, and without drama or spectacle, unquote. On November 25th, Walter Terry published selections of Gabovich's second review of NYCB in an article entitled A Revelation for Russians. In it, Terry quoted selectively from Gabovich's review to demonstrate how well Americans were performing in the ballet exchanges. According to Terry, the Soviets were beginning to recognize that, quote, Russian ballet, choreographically speaking, is way behind the times, unquote. To him, Gabovich's article was evidence that, quote, the ballet revelation induced by Balanchine is going to lead to ballet revolution within the cultural life of the Soviet Union, unquote. Terry's triumphant language brought forward all the positive points that Gabovich made about Balanchine's style of dance, yet stripped them of content. His version of Gabovich's article seems to be a recognition of Balanchinian and American exceptionalism. In its unedited form, Gabovich's article is one of the critical highlights of the Soviet-American exchange. The review delved deeply into the company's strengths and into the choreographer's style. Gabovich praised the polyphonic arrangements that Balanchine created and celebrated the lack of outwardly virtuosic dancing. So acute was his understanding of Balanchine that Grigorovich's review is, I believe, the source of an aphorism that is now almost universally associated with Balanchine: see the music, hear the dance. In particular, Terry did not quote any of Grigorovich's writing from the final section of his article, in which he argued that Balanchine's style should be allowed to exist alongside choreographic symphonism and drama ballet. He called for greater artistic acceptance of New York City Ballet's style in the Soviet Union, but he also defended Soviet ballet from Balanchine. Grigorovich quoted the choreographer's claim that ballet is a flower and responded, "That is quite right. Even the symbolic comparison with beautiful flowers. Yes, the flowers that Albrecht holds in his hands as he walks towards Giselle's grave are beautiful, but 3 times lovelier are the sadness, the anguish, and the repentance felt by the man who kneels and scatters white flowers on the grave. Man and flowers, that is the poetic symbol of romantic ballet." By invoking the deeply symbolic flowers in Giselle, one of the most famous 19th century story ballets, Grigorovich tried to remind his audiences that Balanchine's ostensibly beautiful and cerebral objects could carry emotional and symbolic resonance. Despite what American critics suggested, the Soviet audiences did not fail to understand New York City Ballet, nor did those who appreciated Balanchine necessarily have to abandon Soviet aesthetics or values in order to do so. They simply reinterpreted the visiting works within their own frames of reference. To Balanchine, his works explored the formal, abstract, beautiful properties of classical music. For many of the Soviet Union's dance community, the same works could explore humanist, even socialist values. Balanchine's visit did not, as Terry suggests, cause everyone in the Soviet Union to give up on their style of dance. Rather, the experience of seeing Balanchine's works underlined the multiplicity possible in ballet, the many meanings that each individual work could have. The visit did not close down an argument about the future of ballet. Rather, it furthered the very practice of debate at the heart of the thaw. Thank you.
Great. So I am going to open up the chat. And if people have questions, they can either write out their questions in the chat and have them read aloud, or you can send us a message asking to speak, or use the raise your hand function, and we will call on you. Lisa Valcanier, I see a hand raised there. I can unmute you, or you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
I'm sorry, you're muted. So.
Oh, we can't hear you. You're still muted. No.
Okay.
Oh, there we go.
Okay. Well, hi. Thank you very much for your great talk.
Thank you.
I would just like to add for the record that the ballet visit was not the first in Soviet American exchanges, that the first one was in 1959, held at the Sokolniki Park. It was huge, for quite a few acres and quite a few pavilions. And it had books, it had kitchen, the famous kitchen debate took place there, and so on, art. But anyway, thank you for the talk. It's just a historic fact I would like to add, being a historian. Thank you.
Oh, yes, thank you. This was just one tiny slice of a huge cultural exchange. That exhibition was enormously important for that exchange. And also, this wasn't even the first full tour of an American ballet company in the Soviet Union, because American Ballet Theater went in 1960 also to the Soviet Union, essentially because the US dance expert panel, the ANTA dance panel, was so worried about sending New York City Ballet, and Balanchine was so nervous about going for these reasons, that they sent ABT first. And it was only when ABT got good reviews that they thought it was like safe to send New York City Ballet along with it. But yes, thank you for that point. I appreciate it.
Sure.
And I have a question in the chat from Britt Shields. Britt, would you like to unmute yourself, or would you like me to read the question for you?
Sure. Thank you so much, Anne, for this really fascinating talk. And this might be outside the bounds of your talk, but I'm just curious in terms of the government officials, both from both governments, did they, who sponsored this exchange, did they consider this to be a success? What were their objectives? Why was ballet seen as such an important component of this exchange? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I think pretty much all the officials were pleased with how this went, which is intriguing. It's always interesting when people on both sides are happy with the results. I think the Americans were a lot more surprised than their Soviet counterparts. I mean, big part, the goal of this was for everything to go smoothly. So the fact that it went smoothly and nobody said horrible things about New York City Ballet, and New York City Ballet performed well, just sort of smoothed everything over. Everybody was happy. This was taking place during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So some other historians have talked about that. In particular, Claire Croft has done a really great job with that. And so for many of them, the fact that these tours kept going during the crisis, the fact that everyone kept performing and audiences kept applauding was in itself a sign that things could still work out, that things were still going normally, that generally Soviet people did not bear terrible will towards Americans. And here they were coming out for this US company and applauding them, and vice versa. And the Bolshoi Ballet was in the US at the same time, also performing to great applause. And so that sort of soothed things on both sides. In terms of the artistic officials, so this was run on the Soviet side by the Soviet Ministry of Culture. I think generally they were happy just because it went so well. They were under some pressure to make sure that the tours, that they were like presenting good things for their audiences, that the idea was on their end sort of that they were bringing artistic accomplishments of the world for Soviet viewers. And so they were pleased on that front that the tours went well. There was like a slight bit of worry amongst some of them and some of the like choreographers and theater leaders that like Americans were more caught up to them than they had previously thought. So in 1963, there was an all-union choreographic conference. And at that, so that's not so much like government official, well, it is, in the Soviet Union, it's mixed. So it's like government officials who are in the theaters and choreographers were concerned that they had thought they were way ahead of the Americans on ballet. And now it looks like the Americans have caught up to us. And so we need to be worried about that moving forward. So I hope that answers your question about the officials.
Absolutely.
And the relationship.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great talk.
All right, and we have a question from Beth Saul. Can you provide any specific examples of how perhaps Soviet-Russian choreography changed after this exchange?
Thank you. That is a really good question. And it's hard to pinpoint for exactly this reason that I was talking about, that the choreography was already changing. So it's hard to know how much of that was already underway and how much of that was specifically because people had seen Balanchine and young choreographers had seen Balanchine and were interested in it. So I really am not sure that we can parse out that separation. But these developments that I was talking about in choreographic symphonism sort of became more and more prominent and really took hold. The thaw ended in the mid-1960s. So during that time, as choreographic symphonism was coming more into its own, there was increased number of ballets that were sort of suite-like in construction, or like more formally musically constructed, or that were story ballets that were done there were story ballets, but that were danced the whole time. So that was what Grigorovich was particularly invested in. These things like Stone Flower, Legend of Love, even his version of Nutcracker, and certainly his Spartacus from 1968, that they are stories, but they're stories told in dance. You never stop to like pantomime that you're going to hit somebody. And there was also during that period increased levels of sexuality that people were willing to show on stage. But again, that's really hard to parse out. Is that because they saw Agon and some people thought that was interesting and they wanted to try doing that? Or was it because they were already moving in this direction? So I think particularly the Rite of Spring that the Bolshoi staged in 1965 is an interesting example of that. And again, also an interesting example of choreography that's trying to map very closely onto the music and into these musical structures. With the end of the thaw in the mid-1960s to the late 1960s, and the sort of start of Brezhnev's reign, those kinds of developments slowed down, but they didn't go back to the previous way of existing. They did not go back to the drama. It's more like they stagnated in the thaw styles that had developed. So Grigorovich was in charge of the Bolshoi, and he basically just kept churning out ballets in that Spartacus style for the rest of his time at the Bolshoi. So that's essentially how it developed. It is very possible that some of those choreographic symphonists were excited by Balanchine and inspired by him, but I think it's really hard to say that any of the things they were doing were like directly because of him.
And we have a question from Catherine Manick. I realize this is a bit off today's topic, but could you say something about how Soviet dance groups were received in the US?
Great, thank you. I can say many things about it because that's the other half of the book. So the American, it's actually it's pretty similar. American audiences were wildly enthusiastic about the Soviet companies. Balletomania reigned across the US, and there were like just endless newspaper articles, magazine articles about these dancers coming. And they were particularly excited about the dancers. Critics were very excited about the dancers, very unexcited about Soviet ballet. So there's particularly a lot of discussion in American press about how Soviet ballet is, and you could even see it from some references in that, like way behind the times, behind. It's always expressed in this language related to modernization theory, that the world should be moving on this trajectory and the Soviet Union has either stalled out or moved off of it. So in particular, you see a lot of accusations that ballets like Romeo and Juliet and Stoneflower are like choreographically frozen in the early 20th century, which I find particularly fascinating given how much they love the Soviet dancers, who are essentially like very talented at doing these things like acting, like expressive dance that the critics really don't like in the choreography, but they love in the performance. It's like a fascinating split. And there's also some concerns about it being like too kitschy. And I think that's also a really interesting just evidence of how ballet had a sort of different place in the US and the Soviet Union. And like Soviet choreographers weren't worried about whether or not their ballets appealed to everyone. Well, they wanted them to appeal to everyone. They were supposed to have a broad appeal and sort of raise Soviet audiences up. And New York City Ballet and sort of modernist American ballet was supposed to be like a way of discerning audiences, like discerning audiences would like this modernist ballet, and it was sort of more upper class. And so American critics really didn't like that broad appeal style in the Soviet companies. And I'm going to stop myself there because I literally could spend the like next hour just talking about that subject. So thank you.
And a question from Jane Harrison. Was the CIA involved in organizing this tour and behind the Cultural Development Organization like they were promoting American art?
So this is a very good question and very interesting. There has been some interesting work done about by Frances Stoner Saunders about how the CIA was involved in developing US cultural institutions during the Cold War as this sort of undercover fight against communism, against the Soviets. I have not seen any direct involvement with the CIA in this tour because I think this is like too overt for them. They tended to be involved in these kinds of like international cooperation societies that weren't like obviously directly sponsored by the US government. I'm sure they had people along with the tour. Like I haven't seen direct confirmation of that. I have seen confirmation that the KGB was sending agents along with the Soviet companies to the US, again, unsurprisingly. But I haven't seen any other involvement than that I'm sure they were debriefing people and stuff like that. I'm sure they were interested in people, Americans going to the Soviet Union, and vice versa. But I don't think they were directly sponsoring it in the ways that they were some of these other cultural projects.
And we have a question from John Semlak. John, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. You should be able to unmute now. There you go.
Now, yeah, I just unmuted. Thank you. Yes, thanks. This is a great presentation. Are there, and I apologize if I missed this, but did any of the American entourage have a chance to write about or reflect upon their impressions of the country? Were they allowed to see any of the country that, you know, maybe like, were they given a chance to see tourist sites or perhaps even wander around not completely escorted or something, like have interactions with the Russian people? Was there any interaction of that nature, and is any of it documented?
So this is a very good question. The interactions that American dancers were allowed to have with people in the Soviet Union were extremely limited. So they did go on sightseeing. They were like taking to important cultural sites, but they were really expected to go around like in a group with their handlers, translators, and have like these very controlled interactions with people. Yes, they have written about those in memoirs, and Claire Croft has interviewed, again, her book Dancers as Diplomats has 2 chapters on this tour, and she's interviewed those participants about their experiences. So I think they were mixed. A lot of them were very excited. They got to meet a lot of theater people, a lot of dance people, and they were excited to recognize connections between them and the Soviet dancers. Many of them mentioned like seeing technical similarities between the way they danced and the way that the Soviet performers danced, and having that kind of overlap. There were some like bad experiences. There were protesters outside the US embassy because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And one of them talked about like having a cigarette put out on her arm while they walked through there. Another one, I'm gonna forget the name of this dancer, I'm sorry, was arrested for filming. He had like a little amateur camera that he was filming, and he was arrested and his film was confiscated from him for, I think he was kept for many hours without anybody telling the US embassy, and the US embassy attaché was like very upset that that had happened without anyone telling him. But the man was released, and I'm pretty sure the film was even given back to him because it was just like filming the park to be able to take that home. So those interactions were very limited, mostly positive, but somewhat mixed.
We have a question from Jillian Lipton. Jillian, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thanks. Thank you for a wonderful talk. And I'm just wondering, since Arthur Mitchell was on this tour, if race played a part either in the Soviet reviews of the company and or in the State Department's plans, because I know that the Soviets were quite critical of the US race relations during the Civil Rights era.
Yeah, thanks.
Topic, but
no, it's really great. This is another one that Croft has covered, and so I tend to not cover it as much. Hugely impactful on both the way the US was presenting the tour, the way they were presenting Mitchell's experience, and the Soviet reviews, though on a sort of like muted level. So audiences and critics absolutely loved Arthur Mitchell in the Soviet Union. There are lots of accounts of people chanting his name after the performances. And the reviews are incredibly impressed with him. And I think that's both because it was very rare for them to see a Black ballet dancer, and also because he was an unbelievable dancer, like an easy star in what was a really amazing company. The US, like those reviews of the reviews that I was talking about, that sort of Terry Martin coverage, really played that down hugely, because this ideology around American ballet having no meaning also allowed them to sort of make this argument that, like, oh, these audiences only love it because of its formal implications, and they love the structure of the ballet and the movement. They can't love it for this sort of this non-art for art's sake reasons. The only way you can love it is through a modernist lens, and that modernist lens denies even the existence of race, basically. The Soviet reviews surprisingly don't mention race, although you could maybe see that, like, if they did, that would play up this idea of, like, the US. I mean, the US was in part sending Mitchell because they had this long program of trying to send African-American artists on tours to sort of subtly say, like, we're not racist. We have African-American opera singers and ballet stars. So it's possible that mentioning that in the reviews would just play into that strategy. There is one really fascinating review of Agon that interprets it as being about American race relations. Like, and in this way that some of the Soviet reviews do, like, doesn't say it might have been about that, like, calls Allegra Kent's part like a slave mistress, like in a romantic relationship with her slave, or something along those lines. Like, it's not like, and this suggests that, it's like, I have seen this ballet and I know what it's about. This is what it's about. That's the only one that I have seen that mentions that. I find it fascinating. She likes the ballet. She thinks that it's like an interesting commentary on that. So I don't have like a clear reading of what that is, other than that it's very much playing into the Soviet Union, trying to mention Soviet critics, Soviet writers, Soviet politicians trying to mention American race relations, and Americans trying to not mention it whenever possible. So thank you for that question. I'm really glad for the opportunity to talk about that.
And we have a question from Ileana Camelia Lenart. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Actually, you know me as Camilla Leonard. This is how I sign my articles. Thank you so much, John Samlak, for the question, because actually it was my question related to how and when and if the American dancers could meet with the, let's say, everyday people of Russia outside of the stages. Because in my research of Graham's tours, exactly during this time in 1962 to Yugoslavia and Poland, things were very different. In Yugoslavia, for instance, Helen McGehee, a former dancer of Graham, could meet a former friend who now moved back to Belgrade without having any problem with, let's say, the local government observers, or she felt very free. She felt that atmosphere extremely welcoming. However, things were different in Poland, in Warsaw, where they felt more the pressure of the, let's say, local, I wouldn't say secret police, but definitely they felt more under a watch of the local people. So I was, officials. I was wondering if the American dancers and Balanchine, per se, were preparing for the tour from an emotional point of view. Were they prepared? Where were they told what to expect? Because I found at the Library of Congress a lot of booklets, because you were talking about the booklets preparing the tour to the Soviets. But I found booklets in which Graham and her dancers were told about what to expect, what's the geography, what's the ethnic composition of Yugoslavia, which are the religions, so they prepared them. So where they prepared. What was Balanchine the most nervous about? What did he fear? Because I read too that he was afraid.
Yeah.
But what exactly? And last but not least, who are the officials of the local elite, intellectual elite, who attended the American Ballet's performances? Because when they went to Washington, for instance, Jackie Kennedy with her daughter Caroline were going and met Plisetskaya at one of the rehearsals.
Mhm.
So I was wondering if they combined, this kind of diplomacy of the performance with the performance of diplomacy. And if Khrushchev attended, he'd like circus, not ballet, but he always knew that ballet is a thing we show people. So I was wondering all this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm actually I'm sorry to tell you, combine this slightly with the material from the 1960 tour, because ABT keeps much, much better written records of everything than New York City Ballet. So I can answer it with a little more accuracy for them. So they definitely got this. So ABT, when they went in 1960, definitely got this advanced briefing about like what to do, what to expect, what are the rules. They were very nervous and they were very much kept in these, like, they were very much sort of like shuffled around. I assume that New York City Ballet was given the same sort of warnings and lectures before they went to the Soviet Union. I don't know about this cultural briefing. It sounds plausible, but I haven't seen anything about it. I would hope that they were giving them that cultural briefing because they were expected to act as diplomats, as you say, like performing diplomacy. Sorry, I have the comments written down so I don't forget the order of questions. Balanchine, there are accounts that he was very, very anxious, and I think that's understandable. And I can't tell you, I can't parse out all the things that he was exactly anxious about or what he was most anxious about. I mean, I think it's very understandable that on a number of levels, this was just incredibly emotionally fraught for him. He was going back to the Soviet Union. He was seeing his family, who he hadn't seen since the 1920s. He met his brother at the airport. There's all this, and his brother was a prominent Soviet composer at that point. So there's definitely like hints in Balanchine's biography that there was like some tension there about like Balanchine having left, about their artistic philosophies. So I think there was familial anxiety. I think there was anxiety about him presenting work to his old colleagues, about how the Soviet government would treat him. And that's also like very reasonable concerns for him to have had. There's also this extra anxiety coming from, there was a 1956 tour by the New York City Ballet in Europe, not in Eastern Europe, in Western Europe, but where Tonneclille Leclerc, who was Balanchine's wife, contracted polio. So their last tour had gone very, very badly and was also fraught. And so Balanchine actually took a break in the middle of the tour. He flew to Western Europe when the company was making one of its stops, and then rejoined them again because he found it kind of overwhelming. And I think that's very understandable that he did. The officials who attended, I don't think Khrushchev attended these, but he often did attend cultural diplomacy presentations, and many high-ranking officials in the Soviet Union did. I know Khrushchev attended like an opera performance by an American soloist during the 2 weeks of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He also attended some of the ABT performances. I don't think he happened to go to the New York City Ballet ones, but there were other major officials who were in attendance and US embassy officials who were in attendance, because these were big, as you say, these were big moments for officials on both sides to demonstrate their engagement with diplomacy. And I think that's also what's going on the Kennedy side when they're seeing the Bolshoi, is that they're sort of demonstrating to the Soviets that they're like willing to negotiate. They're here. They want to have a good relationship. Do they want to have a good relationship? But at least they're demonstrating that publicly. And for a domestic audience, particularly for the Kennedys, showing like, look at what great statespeople we are. So Kennedy went and saw the Bolshoi perform Swan Lake. And that's sort of playing up his role in the Cuban, like this is just after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Like, here I am, this great statesman black tie at this event, you know, being the leader of my country and graciously welcoming these people. And this is like exactly playing into his both domestic and international politics in a perfect way.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
You
thank you.
answered wonderfully. Thank you.
And we have a question from Irina Sirotkina. Irina, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Alexander. I'm a dance historian based in Moscow, so I'm watching you in the Moscow evening, very cold evening. And,
oh, thank you.
Yeah, minus 13. Thank you, Anne, for your paper, and I do appreciate your point about the music. The music played actually a key role in the acceptance of Balanchine's ballet in Moscow. But I think people here present know that Balanchine wasn't the inventor of the genre of the symphonic ballet, and indeed it was Fyodor Lopukhov, his teacher at the Mariinsky Theater, and the one that created one of the first symphonic ballet, Величие мироздания, the greatness of the universe, in which Balanchivadze, the young Georgy Balanchivadze, danced as part of the young Mariinsky ballet. And I think Lopukhov was still alive in 1962. And I wonder whether they could meet with Balanchine and Lopukhov and discuss indeed the genre and the turn that the genre took in the States, and perhaps also the reasons why this genre wasn't developed any further in the Soviet Russia.
So they did meet. I'm not sure if they met one-on-one or in a slightly larger group with young choreographers, but they definitely saw each other. Balanchine was not one to write down his impressions of many things, so I don't have any like direct evidence about what they discussed at that meeting, other than I think Balanchine's choreography. I have heard from Elizabeth Kendall said that Lopukhov was upset afterwards that Balanchine hadn't given him enough credit for being the inventor of the symphonic ballet. And I actually found a telegraph in Balanchine's papers to Lopukhov, I think after this, saying like, I always tell my students that you're the inventor of the symphonic ballet, I think maybe to smooth out those feelings. So yes, I think like Balanchine did give Lopukhov credit. There were other choreographers moving along the same lines at the same time. So Leonid Massin also really big in this early symphonic ballet, and James Steichen has done some great research on Balanchine's early years in the US and his relationship with those choreographers, and Elizabeth Kendall has done some lovely work on Balanchine's relationship with Lopukhov. But I don't know the exact contents of that meeting, I'm sorry to tell you, but thank you for the question. It's a great one, and I wish I knew what they discussed.
All right, any more questions?
Oh, I think there's, oh, I have one actually in a direct message from Amanda Vale. I don't know if, Amanda, you care if I read that one out loud? I assume you're fine with it? Okay. So the question is, what was the objection to the ballets that weren't presented on the tour? Ivesiana might have been a little weird for Soviet audiences. Yes, and the cage was probably too kinky. Also very true, but Fawn, what could be wrong with that? I think this is a great question. I think even Afternoon of a Fawn is like slightly too sexually provocative. So this was just a fascinating trend that I saw, that Americans were always absolutely convinced that the Soviets would object to abstraction and were always on the guard for it and anxious about it. And so Soviet officials did not care at all, but were paranoid about American sexuality. And so this also happened, paranoid's maybe a little strong, but like we're very worried about sexuality in their ballets and in American ballets that were coming out at the time. So in 1960, the sort of person who came in and looked through the ABT repertoire convinced them not to bring Billy the Kid and Fall River Legend, also because they were sort of, it's too sexual, too immoral, because these are about like bad, immoral people, granted having tragic lives, but they're not sort of, it doesn't have like a strong moral center. So I assume Fawn was turned down for the same reasons, because it is sexual. It, depending on how you perform it, it could be more or less. I agree, but it's also, I assume that's why I can't see any other reason to cut it, because otherwise it's very similar to the other ballets that they took.
Great talk.
Sorry, I didn't catch that. Oh, thank you.
Great talk.
I'm gonna make everybody repeat that. Like, yeah, but they were also worried about this in their own ballets. The Jakobson version of Spartacus came under the same criticism. The Rite of Spring production by Kasatkina and Vasilyov came under the same criticism. It was just, that was the real big point of debate in the Soviet Union. And particularly just like Americans at the time, and I think since, like to say that abstraction is dangerous because you could read anything into it. Like you could read dissident readings into an abstract piece of art. And that's true, but you can also read an official reading into the abstract work of art, and a work of art that has a clearly bad meaning was considered much more dangerous than a work that could be interpreted in multiple ways. So thank you. And thank you for that question, because I always want to talk about that because I just find it so intriguing.
Great. If we don't have any more questions, we can wrap up. Anyone else? Elizabeth Falconer, go ahead. You can unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Oh.
I'm
sorry.
We can't hear you. You're muted.
You're still muted.
Still can't hear you.
I can try to find.
There we go.
Oh, okay. I would like to add another thing about CIA involvement.
Sure.
Since I was at the exhibit in 1959 in Moscow at the book exhibit. Well, anyway, the Soviets, the Soviet visitors were stealing books at an enormous rate. And of course, we were told to turn our eyes the other way. They even tore up the Sears Roebuck catalog, page by page, just to get a memento or whatever, a reminder of the exhibit. But anyway, the books disappeared. And so the CIA sent us a plane load, or the government, I don't think the government did, but the plane load, and of course it was written up in our press and so on, a good propaganda, anti-Soviet propaganda gesture. But after the exhibit, CIA got in touch with me, I forget how, but not to spy, but offered to send books for me. And I'm afraid, I had so many requests for books that I took advantage of it. And, I could send as many books as I want, or it just involved sending I suppose the address of a person there. And it usually was books on American art or Western literature. So it was really, I was very grateful to CIA for that particular program, because it had effect, because Soviet Union was really cut off from the rest of the world in those days, and anything from outside was passed from hand to hand and had a tremendous impact. So thank you.
No, thank you. I really appreciate that.
All right. Unless anybody else has any questions, we can wrap up. Sure.
A little bit off topic, but did you come across during your studies and research about the intentions of the Americans to tour the bloc, the Eastern Bloc? as I was born in Romania, studied dance in Romania, I am like Balanchine, Eastern European by birth and American by by choice. Did they contemplate the idea of, maybe expanding their message of modernism and unique dance to other countries of the bloc, which were welcoming probably towards American cultural propaganda?
Yeah, no, for sure. They did tour, and often these Soviet tours were part of a larger sort of tour of both Western and Eastern Europe.
Right.
I mean, also to save money on the part of the State Department if you're like flying people out there. And in many ways, that's what the companies wanted, were these other tours in Western and Eastern Europe. And this, particularly for New York City Ballet, the Soviet tour is almost like the bitter pill to swallow to get to these other places where they thought people would like them. I mean, it turned out the Soviets did like them, but yeah, no, they absolutely toured other places as well. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Anne, for a wonderful talk. Thank you, everybody, for your great questions. And I will stop recording now. And if anybody has any other questions for Anne and wants to stick around, please go ahead. I won't end the meeting yet.
Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.